bebådar det idag allmänt iakttagbara västerländska föraktet för sina egna nationer, det som kallas oikofobi, för västvärldens undergång. Här intervjuar jag den svenskfödda amerikanska akademikern Benedict Beckel som skrivit boken Western Self-Contempt, Oikofobia in the Decline of Civilizations. Välkomna till Bulletin-podden med mig, Ronny Berggren. Benedict Beckel, welcome to Bulletin podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are American, but you are born in Sweden, and I would like to ask you to, maybe in Swedish, explain a little bit about your background, your academic background.
Ja, just det. Så jag föddes i Sverige, i Uppsala. Sen flyttade vi till Stockholm också ett par år innan vi emigrerade. Jag var 14 när vi flyttade till USA, till New York. Men större delen av min akademiska bildning ägde rum i Europa faktiskt, i Tyskland och Frankrike, främst i Tyskland. Det var i Tyskland som jag fick både min magister och min doktorsgrad i filosofi och i klassisk filologi, alltså grekiska och latin. Men sen jag var forskare och undervisade som docent, jag vet inte om det rätta ordet är docent på svenska, vi skulle säga professor bara på engelska, men i Tyskland och Frankrike och delvis i Italien också. En del forskade jag där också. Men nu är jag tillbaka till USA. Jag har varit här i USA nu tillbaka de senaste 10 åren och koncentrerat mig på skrivandet. Jag kan inte undervisa här i USA eftersom vår akademiska värld är så extremt vänstervriden att det inte finns utrymme för sådana som mig.
Betyder det att du är konservativ?
Jag egentligen klassar mig inte som konservativ faktiskt. För att jag är lite för heterodox för att vara konservativ. Det är vissa frågor är jag faktiskt tycker de konservativa inte om vad jag tycker och tänker. Det är lite, jag pratade om det med Aron Flam häromveckan. Att jag till exempel inte tror på den fria viljan. Och det är någonting som, det är naturligtvis inte en konservativ åsikt. Men det är inget tvivel om att jag lutar mer åt det konservativa, i alla fall åt det progressiva hållet. Det stämmer absolut. Mm. Och för andra så, i vissa frågor är jag antagligen ännu mer åt höger än vissa konservativa. Så det får man inte vara. Så är det. Ja.
Vi kommer nog komma in på det i slutet av intervjun, tänkte jag lite mer om det akademiska. Men om vi går in på, nu byter vi till engelska här, om vi går in på den här boken du har skrivit. You have written a book named Western Self-Contempt, Oikofobia in the Decline of Civilizations. And my first question is, why the interest in oikophobia?
The interest in oikophobia is because I was confronted with it everywhere. And as I think many of us are. But for me, it wasn't just something that bothered me on a personal level, but it obviously also had real professional ramifications because oikophobia, cultural self-hate, is especially common in the academic world. And since I was involved in the academic world much of my life, that was something that became increasingly that made it increasingly difficult to get one's work done. Now, I was working for a long time in an area where oikophobia was not as prevalent. People were oikophobes, but it wasn't as relevant for the work we were doing. But nonetheless, in my dealing with fellow academics and also in society at large, I just noticed more and more this sort of knee-jerk reaction that Westerners had against the West. And obviously, once one notices that, the question comes, well, why is this the case? And I didn't really do a whole lot of research for the question because it's sort of the answer to why this is the case sort of presented itself to me, and then I just had to write it all down. But one thing that was helpful was the term oikophobia itself, coined by Roger Scruton, which I came across sometime in the 2000s. So about 20 years ago, I happened to come across the term. And just having a term, something to call it, of course, was helpful in writing out the theory of why it happens.
So what is oikophobia?
So oikophobia is cultural self-hate or cultural self-contempt, as is the title of the book, Western Self-Contempt. And it is essentially this knee-jerk reaction that people have that their own culture is at fault. And is no better and generally even worse than other cultures. So it's when Americans think that everything that's wrong with the world is America's fault. It's when Scandinavians think that there is no such thing as real Scandinavian culture, whereas all of the immigrants that come to Sweden or to Scandinavia, they all have genuine, beautiful traditions that they represent, whereas we Swedes, we don't really have anything to be proud of. It is when Germans, for that matter, feel such guilt at their past. Now, in their case, of course, that guilt is not entirely misplaced, but it is when it leads to them being so self-effacing that they have no sense of preserving the good parts of their tradition in the face of the immigration that comes from other parts of the world, and so on and so forth. I mean, the examples are endless.
Yeah.
But it's basically it's when Westerners think that everything Western is, or much Western is bad.
You know, I have two examples of this. One is from Sweden. In 2017, there was an artist who put a flagpole with a Swedish flag, a bent flagpole, on Sergels torg in Stockholm. And, you know, this bent flagpole with a flag, you know, towards the ground, I felt that was, I felt that this is oikophobia.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't see that, but yeah, that sounds exactly like oikophobia. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that brings me to the other question. Because you write about this in your book, what defines an oikophobe? A person that yeah.
Yeah. So an oikophobe is this kind of person. It's an oikophobe is generally someone who's very vain, because by pointing out that his culture is backward or is wrong in some way, he of course is able to raise himself individually vis-a-vis the rest of his culture. So vanity is really the main engine behind oikophobia, because if I'm able, as an oikophobe, I'm able to point out all of the bad things in my culture and how backward all of the, in my case, all of the Americans are around me, or a Swedish oikophobe, how backward all the Swedes are around me, then I individually, of course, am much better. And I may save myself from the ruinous state of my own civilization. And so that is the typical oikophobe. Obviously, there are individual differences, but that is the typical oikophobe. Someone who wants to, someone who is quite self-important, really, and who aggrandizes himself by putting down everything around him.
You know, Canada has a prime minister named Justin Trudeau, and a couple of years ago he visited India. I'm born in India, by the way, but you know, he didn't come to India in a classic Western suit, but instead he dressed up like some kind of Hindu Brahmin, and you know, he was bowing his head and greeting everyone with his hands together, and is that an example of an oikophobe?
Yes, it is. And it was funny. I remember seeing those pictures, and it was funny to see that the actual Indians around him, they were all wearing Western suits, and he was the only one standing in traditional Indian garb. And yes, so that is someone who's an oikophobe in the sense. So that is the particular flavor of oikophobia called allophilia, so the love of the other. So he wasn't especially degrading Canadian culture by that act. Rather, he was trying, in his own odd way, trying to raise Indian culture by showing a love of Indian culture. But yes, allophilia, love of the other, goes hand in hand, typically speaking, with oikophobia, because if you degrade your own culture, then concomitantly you would also raise other cultures and say that they are better. And so yes, I think Justin Trudeau is a classic oikophobe in many ways.
Yeah, and Justin Trudeau he's a person of his time, of the times we are living in, and most people do assume that oikophobia is something totally new, like a modern Western trend. But your book tells the story about that oikophobia began in ancient Greece and has since then become a cause, or maybe at least a sign of civilizations in decline. So can you tell me the history about ancient Greece and what it teaches us about oikophobia?
Yeah, so it starts in ancient Greece because ancient Greece is the first Western nation where the prerequisites, well, it's not a nation, but it's the first Western culture, I should say, where the prerequisites for oikophobia apply. And some of those prerequisites are a certain success, a certain civilizational success, the fact that the fact that the civilizational enemy has been repulsed, the Persians in the case of the Greeks, the fact that you have a certain sense of leisure and security and wealth, so that whatever threatens you from the outside has receded into the background, and you're able to focus your critique, your concentration, your thoughts on internal matters. And ancient Greece, in particular ancient Athens in the late 5th century BC, is the first Western civilization or the first Western culture for which this is true. And so this is why oikophobia starts there. And so we recognize a lot of the patterns that take place in ancient Greece and ancient Athens. We recognize them today. And it begins with a certain questioning of one's own traditions, which in and of itself is not oikophobic. Of course, one can question one's own tradition and certain aspects of that tradition without this meaning that one hates one's own culture. But it begins with questioning traditional Greek religion. It almost always begins with a questioning of one's own religion, and one sees that in the second half of the 5th century. And then gradually it leads over the decades, and now we're getting into the early 4th century BC, it leads into a wholesale questioning of Greek culture as such, and into a raising of other cultures. Now in the Greek case, they don't have as strong a sense of other cultures, excuse me, as we have in modern times, but they do have the sense that they do have a certain sense of cosmopolitanism that develops, which is to say the Greek is not special, the Greek is not superior, which is what the generation of their grandfathers had thought. Rather, we are citizens of the world, and we can practice other customs that are just as good as, if not better than, Greek customs. So that all begins in ancient Greece. And there are other ancillary phenomena that appear alongside oikophobia, such as androgyny, for example, vegetarianism, the importation of certain Eastern cults that replace the own traditional religion. These are all phenomena that we recognize in modernity. Excuse me. Certainly androgyny. And now the details are different from civilization to civilization. So the kind of androgyny we have today with transsexualism and everything like this, obviously that's a certain form. They don't have that a precise form of androgyny in ancient Greece. But the idea of a certain fluidity of the sexes, if you will, and that men become more effeminate and so on, that takes place in every civilization as it declines, in every Western civilization as it declines, and goes hand in hand with oikophobia. And so there are no real exceptions to this rule as we study the decline of civilizations and the development of oikophobia in them. So these are some phenomena we recognize in ancient Greece that would make sense to us today as well, because we have the same thing.
Yeah, I read a couple of years ago, I read Sir John Glubb's The Fate of Empires, The Search for Survival. And he yes. basically says that civilizations passes through 6 stages: outburst, conquest, commerce, affluence, intellect, and decadence. Do you share his analysis? Because I see similarities, like I'm a newbie, but I see similarities between his analysis and your, you put, the stages of civilization in your book.
Yeah. So he's on a very sort of macro level with a bird's eye view. He's right. The problem is when you get into the details. I mean, his work, his essay can't be that detailed because it's very short. But the problem with him is simply that he's too specific in the sense of not in the sense of being detailed, but he's too specific in the model. He says this is the model, and this holds for every civilization, and that's not true. There are, and this I make sure to point this out in my book, there are differences among the civilizations, and we can't say it's exactly the same. Probably my biggest problem with Glubb is that he says that each civilization lasts about 250 years, and that's plainly false. He has to have a very arbitrary delineation of when a civilization begins and when it ends in order to be able to say that. So that's simply not accurate. And as for the division into these 6 phases, yes, there's some truth to that, as long as one keeps in mind that that there are not clear lines between these phases, that they flow into each other. And so it's not that there are clear chronological phases, it's more that they represent certain cultural phases or certain cultural stages and postures that civilizations go through, but they do intermingle with each other.
Yeah.
And so it's important to keep that in mind. But yes, there's certainly some truth in what Glubb says. Yes.
I assume the new thing for modern people in who aren't academic like you are is that you can learn from the ancient civilizations. You can learn things. I assume that's yes. a new thing for our generation here and now. Let's move on to Or did you want to elaborate on that? Yeah.
No, not really. But you're right. Yeah, it certainly helps if one wants to be heard by the general public. Yes, it does help to simplify things a little bit. And I mean, I do simplify to some extent in my book as well. It's necessary, as I say, in order for us to see patterns, we kind of do have to take a bird's eye view. If we go too much into the tiny details of every single civilization, we're going to lose track of what the larger picture is, of what the patterns are that repeat themselves. But having said that, it's still important to keep in mind that there are differences from civilization to civilization.
Yeah, and you go through a lot of civilizations, but we're going to jump to the United States. This is one of my favorite subjects, politics in America. And you write a lot about, oikophobia, how it evolved in America and did it very quickly compared to other civilizations. Can you tell me briefly the history of oikophobia in the United States?
Yeah, so in the United States, it comes later than in any other Western civilization. So the United States is the latest manifestation of oikophobia in the West, which makes sense because obviously we're relatively a new culture compared to Europe. And so some of the ideas that are necessary, some of the groundwork that has to be laid in order for oikophobia to appear was laid later here than in Europe. So the first signs, if you will, of oikophobia begins in so oikophobia, mass oikophobia really begins in the 1960s in the United States, and probably everybody knows what happened in the 1960s, 1970s, student rebellion. Vietnam War, exactly, student rebellions and all of these things, which of course also happened in Europe to some extent, but oikophobia already existed there before. Certain signs of oikophobia, or what will become oikophobia, you can find later on in the United States as well. For example, in the 1950s with the beatnik generation, the poets who remove themselves from the American context. They embrace Buddhism, for example, which is an Eastern religion, just as ancient Greeks and ancient Romans had also embraced Eastern religions at the expense of their own religion. And even a little earlier in the 1920s, you had a lot of American writers who became expatriates in France and so on because they looked down on American ways. But really, these are still relatively elite cliques that do this, elite groups of people, if elite is the word. But as a mass phenomenon, it really comes in the 60s and 70s. And it's important to note that it comes at a time, and this is something that the United States has in common with other countries that have gone through a similar process, is that it comes after the culture has reached its peak, after the culture has already been very successful and has achieved great geopolitical power, which obviously the United States does have at that time. And this is sort of the internal contradiction of oikophobia, that oikophobia can only appear, self-hatred can only appear once the own culture has been very successful. If that is not the case, oikophobia does not appear. And so oikophobia is an attack on the thing from which the success comes, which will always be the internal contradiction of oikophobia. But so in the United States, and this is also a sign of the fact that the development of oikophobia hasn't come as far yet as in certain other countries, even though individual expressions of our oikophobia are very extreme, more extreme than in Europe in most cases. We still have a very strong resistance to that oikophobia, and this is a sign of the fact that here the struggle is still ongoing. There is, of course, a certain resistance to it in Europe as well, but what oikophobia seeks to accomplish has already been much, much more successful in Europe, whereas, talking now about Western and Northern Europe, not so much Eastern Europe, whereas in the United States, the conservative resistance to this change is still very strong, which is to say, if you travel to different places in Sweden, of course, yes, you will come across different opinions depending on where you go and what kind of society you move in within Sweden, but there will be a closer similarity similarity of opinion regardless of where you go in Sweden, whereas in the United States, depending on where you are, you would think that you're in a different country based on the opinions that you hear.
Yeah.
And so that's a sign of the fact that the resistance to oikophobia is still very, very strong here, and it's based on a real culture that Americans are proud in. And so here we see that the oikophobes have not yet been completely successful here in the United States. So we are in that sense at an earlier historical stage.
Yeah, let's get back to that in a moment. But if you,
Okay.
when you talk about, the oikophobes, it's very interesting that you speak about, how oikophobia started and began during the Vietnam War, and you mention a lot of, well-known academics like Noam Chomsky and Gore Vidal and people like that who
Hmm.
basically put, the Frankfurt School into the United States and made it popular
Hmm.
of common people. But you also mentioned two presidents, and I found that very interesting.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama, because American
Yes.
politics is an interest of mine, and I was a very big fan of George W. Bush. And when
Mm.
Barack Obama won the election and basically took over the White House, then after a couple of months he went to, I think it was a NATO summit or something in Canada, and he was asked, "Do you believe in American exceptionalism?" I remember this very, very clearly, and he said, "Well, I assume that I believe in American exceptionalism the same way that Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism, and so on." And
Mm.
I thought that, like, this is very different from George W. Bush because he was more like a
Yes.
patriot. So I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter. Can you are they oikophobes?
Yes, they are. Absolutely, classic cases. And I do remember the example you were talking about there when he said that, which I also remember made me raise an eyebrow at the time. Not only because of the sort of relativist okophobia that's transparent there, but also because when it comes from the president is supposed to be, so to speak, the cheerleader of the United States. And so I think it was a betrayal also of not just of certain ideas, but also of the duties of his office. Of his office as president. Now, Jimmy Carter, he's an okophobe. Now, admittedly, Jimmy Carter's okophobia has become even clearer post-presidency. Some of the things he's written since he left office. But you can see traces of it already during his presidency as well. I mean, he's somebody who downplays American exceptionalism, albeit not as explicitly, if you will, as Barack Obama does it. And that's also because, again, the development of okophobia at Jimmy Carter's time when he was president hasn't gone as far yet. And so there's a certain language of okophobia that hasn't fully developed at the time of Jimmy Carter, even though he is quite anti-Western in many ways. But that language has become more fully developed by the time of Barack Obama. And so he's able to give a more obvious expression to it. But you see it in Jimmy Carter, I mean, at certain things that he writes post-presidency as well, when he attacks Western interests at the expense of non-Western interests. One probably sees it most obviously in the case of the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine conflict, but elsewhere as well. And Barack Obama is similar to Justin Trudeau, a very typical case of okophobia, because again, he thinks that there's nothing special with typical expressions of American patriotism. He looks down on it, and he is a globalist in many ways. You could say somebody for whom national borders are something traditional, old-fashioned, and quaint. Something that only old American rubes in the hinterland care about. Obviously not enlightened people like him. All of these are typical expressions of okophobia. And Barack Obama, from the presidential point of view, he's not far from the first to express that okophobia in the United States, but he's the first president to give very clear expression in the type of language he uses to it. And then, of course, that's continued by Joe Biden. Obviously, Donald Trump is a break there in the development. But Joe Biden uses similar kind of language as well, not to mention the person who I hope will not be my next president. We'll see. But yeah.
Yeah, Kamala Harris. I say her name
Yes.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I have a question about Bill Clinton too, because when we talk about civilizations, we can't forget to mention Samuel Huntington and his Clash of Civilizations. And when Bill Clinton was president, he basically bashed Samuel Huntington from the United Nations. He said something like, "We don't believe in this, Clash of Civilizations," or something like that. Is that a sign of oikophobia too? Bill Clinton and what he said.
The opinion itself, that particular opinion itself, not really. I think Huntington is right mostly about what he says in that book, and I think much of what he says in that book has also come true, or we see it's in the process of coming true. Bill Clinton, I wouldn't call him a typical oikophobe in that, certainly not as clear as as Carter or Obama, he certainly has certain tendencies, yes, in that sense. I mean, he's certainly moving in the direction of a globalist allophilia, I would say. But the kind of language he uses isn't as degrading of American ways or American culture. Could be partly just because he's a fairly savvy politician and he knows and he knew how to tell people what they wanted to hear. Whereas Obama was much more divisive in his rhetoric. He didn't, maybe not so much when he was running for president the first time, when he was able to fool a lot of people with all his talk about unity and so on, which of course many of us were able to see through at the time. But Clinton is also more typically American himself, if there is such a thing, than Obama was. And I mean, certain of his mannerisms are so typically American that one could see, oh yeah, right away, that's a typical American right there when one looks at the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, and so on. So I wouldn't say he's a typical oikophobe, no, but we see certain tendencies at least that are moving in that direction in Bill Clinton.
Yeah, I consider oikophobia to be a threat to Western civilization, and I believe that we need to defend Western civilization, especially now.
Yes.
And you spoke about the difference between Europe and the United States. That in the United States there is an actual resistance to oikophobia and left-wing academics. Can you explain a little bit more about what defines the resistance in the United States? Do you mean the Republican Party? Do you mean Donald Trump? What do you mean?
Yeah, so it's not identical to the Republican Party or to Donald Trump, but yes, I mean certainly the right wing of the United States. Now, of course, and this is also something that I mentioned in the book, the initial caveat should be that there's also such a thing as reactionary oikophobia, which I do mention in the book. It's a historical tendency that we see in earlier civilizations as well, which is what happens when conservatives, already Plato is an example of this, so this phenomenon as well has been around for a long time. It's basically what happens when conservatives see what the progressives are doing to their culture, and so they start to hate what they perceive their own culture has become. And so that's a sort of reactionary oikophobia. So it's sort of it applies opposite force, and you see this on certain elements of paleoconservatism, especially here in the United States. You see that there is a certain glorification of Russia, for example. So that's allophilia, love of the other, a certain glorification of Russia, and a denigration of the United States by certain elements of the right. So that is not, in my opinion, a successful or a healthy resistance to typical left-wing oikophobia, which is the main phenomenon we're talking about. But other elements of the right, yes, certainly do offer a genuine resistance to oikophobia. And so big parts of the Republican Party and of more, I guess I would say, more mainstream conservatives, as opposed to some paleoconservatives whose views are questionable, although not all paleoconservatives fall in this camp.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but I also think that when you speak about the difference between the United States and Europe, I also think that you mean something deeper in the United States, because in the United States you have a positive vision, and I imagine that you are thinking about the Constitution. My favorite philosopher is Thomas Jefferson. So
okay.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for American institutions and the founding fathers and things like that, and I believe that this is what you think of, because Europe does not have these kind of role models.
Right. Yes. No, exactly. And this is an interesting distinction between Europe and America as well in this regard. The resistance that we see in Europe from the right-wing party, or the so-called far-right parties, which aren't really far-right, but anyway, the quote-unquote far-right parties in Europe, is that when they defend their own civilization as against oikophobic attacks, it's not rooted in such specific institutions as it is here in the United States. And so in that sense, American resistance to oikophobia is more positive, because it's not just trying to defeat oikophobia and trying to put down oikophobia, but it's also really trying to raise and embrace one's own tradition, one's own specific heritage, and we can point at very specific things. And so our resistance here is rooted has a more positive flavor, because it's actually also expressed in love for something that genuinely is our own. And as you say, our federalism, our constitution, our traditional freedom, our traditional freedoms, First Amendment, freedom of speech, and the right to bear arms, all of these things. Our religion, obviously, the fact that we have still, even though America, like everywhere else, is slowly becoming more and more atheist, but is still more religious than other Western countries are. And so all of these things together, they constitute a very positive vision of the world. Again, whether one agrees with that vision or not is a separate question, but it constitutes a very positive statement about the world. And so I think that's another reason why so far also resistance to oikophobia in the United States has been reasonably successful, or at least continues to be reasonably strong. We'll see how things go now in the next few months, in the next few years. But resistance has been successful because it's attractive, because it's based in love of something. It's not just an attack on something else, but it's based in a genuine love of our own history, of our own traditions, and of our own freedoms. When Americans say that America is the freest country in the world, that's not just an empty slogan. Maybe some people feel differently, but it's not just an empty slogan. It's actually based in real, concrete laws and traditions that we have here.
Yeah, and one thing that differs Europe from America is that you know what you believe. You know what an American are. You are basically a nation based on a creed, on the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. But when you ask a Swede, I mean, you are Swedish too. So when you ask a Swede, what is a Swede? He or she wouldn't know. What defines Sweden? Well, I'm not sure. Maybe we eat maybe we fira midsommar, perhaps. But an American knows that, at least if they want to acknowledge it, they know that we believe in liberty, we believe in you can read yourself, basically read the Constitution. Yeah, and that is a source of strength in a situation like this, when you have to defend something and fight back. Then that is a source of strength. But while Swedes, most likely, we don't know why we should defend Sweden. Do you understand what I'm trying to
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And it's, and this is, and one also sees this now. I'm not as involved in public Swedish discourse as you are, of course, but I've noticed as well, I mean, from what I've seen in Sweden, is that when there are these attacks on oikophobia, which, by the way, attacks that I support, of course. I mean, I would also support that resistance in Sweden, but it is a little, it's just less specific, quite simply. I mean, they talk about the pleasure of Swedish herring, for example, of sill, matjessill, and things like this, which are wonderful things, but it's just less specific, and it tends to be much more cultural, like the Swedish food, Swedish customs, and so on. Here in Sweden, we shake hands, for example, which again, these are fairly superficial expressions of a culture. They are part of a culture, but if one truly wants to understand a culture, one has to go much deeper than that. Swedish resistance and other West European resistance to oikophobia is, for example, also not particularly rooted in religion. One often finds that the anti-oikophobes are not much more religious than the oikophobes. There are exceptions, of course, but very often that's the case. Whereas here in the United States, we do have many more specific things, as you say, to defend. And so I certainly think you're right in making that distinction, yeah.
Yeah, in your book, you basically, just like Lab, you say like a civilization go through different stages. And I would like to ask, do you think it's determined? Because, I want to make resistance against, oikophobia and other things like that. But is that possible if, history just repeats itself?
Right. So I would say the short answer is yes. Resistance is worthwhile, and we should resist it. Now, the question of historical determinism, of course, now that's something we could talk about for probably a couple of hours. I have a whole epilogue in the book where I discuss this subject, and this is something in my conversation with Arm Flam a while ago. I guess one of the rare points of disagreement between us. But basically, the idea is that, yes, we do see that this pattern repeats itself. We see that it happened in Greece, in Rome, in France, in England, and so on, and now in the United States and in other countries as well. And so one might ask, well, what's the point of even resisting then? If we see that the end result tends to be the same anyway across the centuries. And the answer to that, of course, is that, well, if we do have that attitude, that what's the point of resisting? Well, then whatever it is that we're worried about is going to happen so much faster. And so whether it would be silly to say that the United States or any other country can go back to exactly the way it was a few hundred years ago. That's never going to happen. The United States is not going to be as religious in 10 years as it was 200 years ago. That's simply not going to happen. I say this as a non-religious person, by the way. It's not that that religion in and of itself is important to me, but it is important as a defense against oikophobia and as a defense of one's own culture. And so there are certain things that simply are not going to change, that are going to only move more or less anyway in one direction. And so we have to be modest about what we can achieve. But we can certainly slow oikophobia. We can and we can resist it if one were to remove all of the resistance that we have here in the United States and that we've been talking about. Things would be so much worse right now. And the United States would have declined so much further. And so even though, yes, we should be sober about what we're able to achieve, we should still embrace that resistance, and we should still do what we can to preserve our cultures and to be proud of our heritage. Yeah.
To make it simple, maybe we might not be able to save the future forever, but we might be able to save the next generation.
Exactly. And and that's also our responsibility as citizens and as parents. I mean, those of us who have children anyway, that is our responsibility. And so I don't think the fact that one can see a certain pattern in history should not be an excuse for anyone to just give up the struggle. I have a friend in Germany he's a religious Catholic. He lives in Berlin, and he sees what's happening all around him. And he has 3 children, and he tells me, I've basically given up. Germany's lost. There's no point. And I tell him, look, I mean, obviously I agree with you what's happening in Germany, but you have 3 children. It's your obligation as a parent to try to do something. And at least within your local neighborhood. I mean, nobody can go out and save the world single-handedly. But if all of us could just try to improve our local neighborhoods and instill a sense of tradition and self-worth in our children, already that in itself, if all of us can only do that, that in and of itself would go a long way. So yeah, that's what I would tell people.
Very interesting. You are an academic, and you're far above my pay grade, but you live in New York.
I'm probably below your pay grade, actually.
Yeah, you live in New York, and that is a very left-wing. I mean, New York is very liberal, and yes. You also seem like a rebel against left-wing academia, and yes. have you been all these things about being cancelled, censored, and have you been berated? Have you been censored? Have you been cancelled?
I've certainly been censored and berated, yes, all the time. I wouldn't say I've been cancelled because I'm not famous enough to be cancelled. So that's one good part about when not enough people know about you, they're not going to come after you. But yes, I've certainly been attacked a lot online, and even when I've written articles, or even the book Western Self-Contempt that we've been talking about, that was published by an academic press, Cornell University Press, and there were certainly attempts there by certain elements within the publishing company to either excise certain passages or to have the book not come out at all. That's certainly been the case. Now, luckily, I had the right people on my side, so it worked out in the end. But that certainly happens all the time. But when it comes specifically to New York City, though, what I can say is that New York City, at least, it's certainly a left-wing city, as you say, but it's large enough, at least, that we still have pockets of sanity left in New York City, as opposed to, for example, if you go to Washington, D.C. or Seattle or something like that, you can't really talk to anyone because everyone is out of his mind, unfortunately. New York, I mean, maybe some local patriotism on my part that I want to defend New York City, but we still, if you know where to go, you can still find people who have not lost their minds yet over here, thankfully. We'll see how long that lasts.
Yeah, exactly. So, final question: what do you have any thoughts about the presidential election and Donald Trump being from New York and everything?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll certainly be voting for him. I voted for him last time as well, and obviously he has his faults. But considering the alternative, there's absolutely no question that I think he should be the president again. If Kamala Harris wins, she's some of the ideas that she has expressed are so radical that would most certainly speed up American decline. No question about that.
Yeah.
Because I mean, America, even though we are a declining power, America is still the guarantor of world peace, more or less, in many parts of the world. And so with her election, because she's respected by absolutely no other world leader, they might tell you, the Democrats might tell you differently, but she's respected by nobody. So there will certainly be more war in the world if she is elected. Whereas Donald Trump, they may not like him, but they do respect him. If he wins, we'll have a little more stability, at least for a while. I would say it looks like he's coming back maybe a little bit in the polls now, so we'll see. Hopefully, and since a lot of pollsters tend to undersample the Republican voters, hopefully the fact that they're kind of in a dead heat right now should be a good sign for the Republicans. Those are basically my thoughts. Donald Trump, I consider him, even though he does have his faults, and there are certain things he has done as president that I didn't entirely agree with, he's still, I would say, the best president of my lifetime, and I include Reagan in that. I think he's better than Reagan, even in many ways, in the sense that he is he's so unapologetically pro-American, which Reagan was to a considerable extent as well. But what I appreciate about Trump is that he thinks a little bit more outside of the box. For example, again, I think the Israel-Palestine conflict is a perfect example. It's been de rigueur for Republicans to say that they're going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, for example. Everybody says they will, and then nobody does, because nobody dares to stir up the hornet's nest. And Donald Trump has this certain naivete about him, which he says, well, if I feel like doing that, then that's what I'm going to do. And so he did. And then, of course, everybody sees that, well, actually his gut instinct was correct, because what so much of the rest of the world respects is power. That might not be the kind of world that we want to live in, but it is the world that we live in. And so if you unabashedly and unembarrassedly express power and self-confidence, that will go a long way in keeping the world stable. So I'm hoping for his victory.
Yeah, but this is very interesting. I have to ask one more question because, in academia, most people say that Donald Trump is dumb. He's not an academic, and we can analyze him and we can understand that, this discourse here and this discourse here. He's a dumb person. We need someone who is smart. You, as a very high educated academic who obviously does not agree with that. What is your response to your colleagues when they say things like that?
Probably two parts to my response. Number one, there are different kinds of smarts. Of course, there are different kinds of intelligence. Yeah, I don't think he reads a lot of books, that's for sure. But he has a certain, I don't think he's a stupid man. I think he has a certain intelligence that Obama did not have, in the sense of understanding people and understanding what makes them tick. I think that helps a lot. And number two, the second thing I would say is that I don't think intelligence is, I mean, obviously, if somebody's a complete moron like Kamala Harris, that's not good, obviously. But I don't think that intelligence or intellect, if you will, is the most important thing in a president. A president should be pro-American. He should have a certain instinct about what other world leaders are like and about what human beings are like, and I think Trump does have that. And that's really what's required. That's the most important thing in a president. Not intellect, certainly not book smarts, but a certain attitude. And then he can surround himself by people who are more intelligent than he is. And I mean, we see this all the time, of course. It's not the person who's the most intelligent is never the one who's going to be president. It's the person who's the most charismatic, who has a certain way of speaking, a certain way of carrying himself. That's the one who's going to be president. And then he has advisors, more self-effacing people who give him good advice in the background. But as long as a president has the right attitude and the right and the patriotism, which certainly Donald Trump has, then everything can fall into place around that. So that would be my answer. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, thanks a lot, Benedict Beckelt, for taking time. It was an honor talking to you, and it was very interesting. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.